Part 5. The Hound of Silence. O hateful error, melancholy's child! Why dost thou show to the apt thoughts of men the things that are not? Shakespeare. Julius Caesar's silver blaze hadn't been missing for long when Inspector Gregory and Colonel Ross identified the stranger who had sneaked into the stable and stolen the prize racehorse. But as usual, Sherlock Holmes was one step ahead of the police. The colonel turned to the great detective. "Is there any point to which you would wish to draw my attention?" "To the curious incident of the dog in the night time." "The dog did nothing in the night time." "That was the curious incident," remarked Sherlock Holmes. "It seems that a dog lived in the stable, that both of the stable hands had slept through the theft, and that these two facts had allowed Holmes to make one of his indubitably shrewd deductions. As he later explained, I had grasped the significance of the silence of the dog. A dog was kept in the stables, and yet, though someone had been in and had fetched out a horse, he had not barked enough to arouse the two lads in the loft. Obviously the midnight visitor was someone whom the dog knew well. Although the inspector and the colonel were aware of what had happened, only Holmes was aware of what hadn't happened. The dog hadn't barked, which meant that the thief was not the stranger whom the police had identified. By paying careful attention to the absence of an event, Sherlock Holmes further distinguished himself from the rest of humankind. As we are about to see, when the rest of humankind imagines the future, it rarely notices what imagination has missed, and the missing pieces are much more important than we realize. The sailor's knot. If you live in a city with tall buildings, then you already know that pigeons have an uncanny ability to defecate at precisely the moment, speed, and position required to score a direct hit on your most expensive sweater. Given their talent as bombardiers, it seems odd that pigeons can't learn to do much simpler things. For example, if a pigeon is put in a cage with two levers that can be briefly illuminated, it can easily learn to press the illuminated lever to get a reward of birdseed, but it can never learn to press the unilluminated lever to receive the same reward. Pigeons have no trouble figuring out that the presence of a light signals an opportunity for eating, but they cannot learn the same thing about the absence of a light. Research suggests that human beings are a bit like pigeons in this regard. For example, volunteers in one study played a deduction game in which they were shown a set of trigrams, i.e., three-letter combinations such as SXY, GTR, BCG, and EVX. The experimenter then pointed to one of the trigrams and told the volunteers that this trigram was special. The volunteers' job was to figure out what made the trigram special, that is, to figure out which feature of the special trigram distinguished it from the others. Volunteers saw set after set, and each time the experimenter pointed out the special one. How many sets did volunteers have to see before they deduced the distinctive feature of the special trigram? For half the volunteers, the special trigram was distinguished by the fact that it contained the letter T, and these volunteers needed to see about 34 sets of trigrams before they figured out that the presence of T is what made a trigram special. For the other half of the volunteers, the special trigram was always distinguished by the fact that it lacked the letter T. The results were astounding. No matter how many sets of trigrams they saw, none of the volunteers ever figured this out. It was easy to notice the presence of a letter, but, like the barking of a dog, it was impossible to notice its absence. Absence in the present. If this tendency were restricted to bird seed and trigrams, we wouldn't care much about it. But as it turns out, the general inability to think about absences is a potent source of error in everyday life. For example, a moment ago I suggested that pigeons have an unusual talent for hitting pedestrians, and if you've ever been the victim of a really good splotching, you've probably concluded the same thing. But what makes us think that the pigeons are actually taking aim and hitting what they aim for? The answer is that most of us can remember far too many instances in which we momentarily passed beneath a ledge festooned with those obnoxious flying rats and were squarely nailed by a stinky white dollop, despite the fact that from the air a human head constitutes a relatively small and fast-moving target. Fair enough. But if we really want to know whether the pigeons are out to get us and have the requisite skills to do so, we must also consider the times when we walked beneath that ledge and came away clean. The right way to calculate the animosity and marksmanship of the urban pigeon is to consider both the presence and the absence of poop on our jackets. If the pigeons have hit us 9 times out of 10, then we should probably give them credit for their accuracy as well as a wide berth. But if they've hit us 9 times out of 9,000, then what seems like good aim and bad attitude is probably nothing more than dumb luck. The misses are crucial to determining what kinds of inferences we can legitimately draw from the hits. Indeed, when scientists want to establish the causal relationship between two things, cloud seeding and rain, heart attacks and cholesterol, you name it, they compute a mathematical index that takes into account co-occurrences. How many people who do have high cholesterol do have heart attacks? And non-co-occurrences, how many people who do have high cholesterol do not have heart attacks, and how many people who do not have high cholesterol do have heart attacks? And co-absences, how many people who don't have high cholesterol don't have heart attacks? All of these quantities are necessary to assess accurately the likelihood that the two things have a real causal relationship. This is all very sensible, of course, to statisticians. But studies show that when ordinary people want to know whether two things are causally related, they routinely search for, attend to, consider, and remember information about what did happen and fail to search for, attend to, consider, and remember information about what did not. Apparently, people have been making this mistake for a very long time. Nearly 4 centuries ago, the philosopher and scientist Sir Francis Bacon wrote about the ways in which the mind errs, and he considered the failure to consider absences among the most serious. By far the greatest impediment and aberration of the human understanding arises from the fact that those things which strike the sense outweigh things which, although they may be more important, do not strike it directly. Hence, contemplation usually ceases with seeing, so much so that little or no attention is paid to things invisible. Bacon illustrated his point with a story, which, it turns out, he borrowed from Cicero, who told it 17 centuries earlier, about a visitor to a Roman temple. To impress the visitor with the power of the gods, the Roman showed him a portrait of several pious sailors whose faith had presumably allowed them to survive a recent shipwreck. When pressed to accept this as evidence of a miracle, the visitor astutely inquired, "But where are the pictures of those who perished after taking their vows?" Scientific research suggests that ordinary folks like us rarely ask to see pictures of the missing sailors. 8. Our inability to think about absences can lead us to make some fairly bizarre judgments. For example, in a study done about 3 decades ago, Americans were asked which countries were most similar to each other, Ceylon and Nepal or West Germany and East Germany. Most picked the latter pair. But when they were asked which countries were most dissimilar, most Americans picked the latter pair as well. Now, how can one pair of countries be both more similar and more dissimilar than another pair? They can't, of course. But when people are asked to judge the similarity of two countries, they tend to look for the presence of similarities, of which East and West Germany had many, for example, their names, and ignore the absence of similarities. When they are asked to judge the dissimilarities of two countries, they tend to look for the presence of dissimilarities, of which East and West Germany had many, for example, their governments, and ignore the absence of dissimilarities. The tendency to ignore absences can befuddle more personal decisions as well. For example, imagine that you are preparing to go on a vacation to one of two islands, Madeira, which has average weather, average beaches, average hotels, and average nightlife, or Extremia, which has beautiful weather and fantastic beaches but crummy hotels and no nightlife. The time has come to make your reservations, so which one would you choose? Most people pick Extremia. But now imagine that you are already holding tentative reservations for both destinations and the time has come to cancel one of them before they charge your credit card. Which would you cancel? Most people choose to cancel their reservation on Extremia. Why would people both select and reject Extremia? Because when we are selecting, we consider the positive attributes of our alternatives, and when we are rejecting, we consider the negative attributes. Extremia has the most positive attributes and the most negative attributes, hence people tend to select it when they are looking for something to select and they reject it when they are looking for something to reject. Of course, the logical way to select a vacation is to consider both the presence and the absence of positive and negative attributes, but that's not what most of us do. Absence in the future. Our inattention to absences influences the way that we think about the future. Just as we do not remember every detail of a past event, what color socks did you wear to your high school graduation? Or see every detail of a current event, what color socks is the person behind you wearing at this very moment? So do we fail to imagine every detail of a future event? You could close your eyes right now and spend 2 full hours imagining yourself driving around in a silver Mercedes-Benz SL600 Roadster with a twin-turbocharged 36-valve 5.5-liter V12 engine. You could imagine the curve of the front grille, the slant of the windshield, and the newish smell of the black leather upholstery. But no matter how long you spent doing this, if I were then to ask you to inspect the mental image you'd created and read to me the numbers on the license plate, you would be forced to admit that you'd left out that particular detail. No one can imagine everything, of course, and it would be absurd to suggest that they should. But just as we tend to treat the details of future events that we do imagine as though they were actually going to happen, we have an equally troubling tendency to treat the details of future events that we don't imagine as though they were not going to happen. In other words, we fail to consider how much imagination fills in, but we also fail to consider how much it leaves out. To illustrate this point, I often ask people to tell me how they think they would feel 2 years after the sudden death of their eldest child. As you can probably guess, this makes me quite popular at parties. I know, this is a gruesome exercise and I'm not asking you to do it. But the fact is that if you did it, you would probably give me the answer that almost everyone gives me, which is some variation on "Are you out of your damned mind?" I'd be devastated, totally devastated. I wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning. I might even kill myself. So who invited you to this party anyway? If at this point I'm not actually wearing the person's cocktail, I usually probe a bit further and ask how he came to his conclusion. What thoughts or images came to mind? What information did he consider? People typically tell me that they imagined hearing the news, or they imagined attending the funeral, or they imagined opening the door to an empty bedroom. But in my long history of asking this question and thereby excluding myself from every social circle to which I formerly belonged, I have yet to hear a single person tell me that in addition to these heartbreaking, morbid images, they also imagined the other things that would inevitably happen in the 2 years following the death of their child. Indeed, not one person has ever mentioned attending another child's school play, or making love with his spouse, or eating a taffy apple on a warm summer evening, or reading a book, or writing a book, or riding a bicycle, or any of the many other activities that we, and that they, would expect to happen in those 2 years. Now, I am in no way, shape, or form suggesting that a bite of gooey candy compensates for the loss of a child. That isn't the point. What I am suggesting is that the 2-year period following a tragic event has to contain something, that is, it must be filled with episodes and occurrences of some kind, and these episodes and occurrences must have some emotional consequences. Regardless of whether those consequences are large or small, negative or positive, one cannot answer my question accurately without considering them. And yet, not one person I know has ever imagined anything other than the single, awful event suggested by my question. When they imagine the future, there is a whole lot missing, and the things that are missing matter. This fact was illustrated by a study in which college students at the University of Virginia were asked to predict how they would feel a few days after their school's football team won or lost an upcoming game against the University of North Carolina. Before making these predictions, one group of students, the describers, was asked to describe the events of a typical day, and one group of students, the non-describers, was not. A few days later the students were asked to report how happy they actually were, and the results showed that only the non-describers had drastically overestimated the impact that the win or the loss would have on them. Why? Because when non-describers imagined the future, they tended to leave out details about the things that would happen after the game was over. For example, they failed to consider the fact that right after their team lost, which would be sad, they would go get drunk with their friends, which would be lovely, or that right after their team won, which would be lovely, they would have to go to the library and start studying for their chemistry final, which would be sad. The non-describers were focused on one and only one aspect of the future, the outcome of the football game, and they failed to imagine other aspects of the future that would influence their happiness, such as drunken parties and chemistry exams. The describers, on the other hand, were more accurate in their predictions precisely because they were forced to consider the details that the non-describers left out. It is difficult to escape the focus of our own attention, difficult to consider what it is we may not be considering, and this is one of the reasons why we so often mispredict our emotional responses to future events. For example, most Americans can be classified as one of two types: those who live in California and are happy they do, and those who don't live in California but believe they'd be happy if they did. Yet, research shows that Californians are actually no happier than anyone else, so why does everyone, including Californians, seem to believe they are? California has some of the most beautiful scenery and some of the best weather in the continental United States, and when non-Californians hear that magic word, their imaginations instantly produce mental images of sunny beaches and giant redwood trees. But while Los Angeles has a better climate than Columbus, climate is just one of many things that determine a person's happiness, and yet all those other things are missing from the mental image. If we were to add some of these missing details to our mental image of beaches and palm trees, say, traffic, supermarkets, airports, sports teams, cable rates, housing costs, earthquakes, landslides, and so on, then we might recognize that LA beats Columbus in some ways, better weather, and Columbus beats LA in others, less traffic. We think that Californians are happier than Ohioans because we imagine California with so few details, and we make no allowance for the fact that the details we are failing to imagine could drastically alter the conclusions we draw. The tendency that causes us to overestimate the happiness of Californians also causes us to underestimate the happiness of people with chronic illnesses or disabilities. For example, when sighted people imagine being blind, they seem to forget that blindness is not a full-time job. Blind people can't see, but they do most of the things that sighted people do. They go on picnics, pay their taxes, listen to music, get stuck in traffic, and thus they are just as happy as sighted people are. They can't do everything sighted people can do, sighted people can't do everything that they can do, and thus blind and sighted lives are not identical. But whatever a blind person's life is like, it is about much more than blindness. And yet, when sighted people imagine being blind, they fail to imagine all the other things that such a life might be about, hence they mispredict how satisfying such a life can be. On the event horizon. About 50 years ago, a pygmy named Kenj took his first trip out of the dense, tropical forests of Africa and onto the open plains in the company of an anthropologist. Buffalo appeared in the distance, small black specks against a bleached sky, and the pygmy surveyed them curiously. Finally, he turned to the anthropologist and asked what kind of insects they were. When I told Kenj that the insects were buffalo, he roared with laughter and told me not to tell such stupid lies. The anthropologist wasn't stupid and he hadn't lied. Rather, because Kenj had lived his entire life in a dense jungle that offered no views of the horizon, he had failed to learn what most of us take for granted, namely, that things look different when they are far away. You and I don't mix up our insects and our ungulates because we are used to looking out across vast expanses, and we learned early on that objects make smaller images on our retinas when they are distant than when they are nearby. How do our brains know whether a small retinal image is being made by a small object that is nearby or a large object that is distant? Details, details, details. Our brains know that the surfaces of nearby objects afford fine-grained details that blur and blend as the object recedes into the distance, and thus they use the level of detail that we can see to estimate the distance between our eye and the object. If the small retinal image is detailed, we can see the fine hairs on a mosquito's head and the cellophane texture of its wings. Our brains assume that the object is about an inch from our eye. If the small retinal image is not detailed, we can see only the vague contour and shadowless form of the buffalo's body. Our brains assume that the object is a few thousand yards away. Just as objects that are near to us in space appear to be more detailed than those that are far away, so do events that are near to us in time. Whereas the near future is finely detailed, the far future is blurry and smooth. For example, when young couples are asked to say what they think of when they envision getting married, those couples who are a month away from the event, either because they are getting married a month later or because they got married a month earlier, envision marriage in a fairly abstract and blurry way, and they offer high-level descriptions such as making a serious commitment or making a mistake. But couples who are getting married the next day envision marriage's concrete details, offering descriptions such as having pictures made or wearing a special outfit. Similarly, when volunteers are asked to imagine themselves locking a door the next day, they describe their mental images with detailed phrases such as putting a key in the lock, but when volunteers are asked to imagine themselves locking a door next year, they describe their mental images with vague phrases such as securing the house. When we think of events in the distant past or distant future, we tend to think abstractly about why they happened or will happen, but when we think of events in the near past or near future, we tend to think concretely about how they happened or will happen. Seeing in time is like seeing in space. But there is one important difference between spatial and temporal horizons. When we perceive a distant buffalo, our brains are aware of the fact that the buffalo looks smooth, vague, and lacking in detail because it is far away, and they do not mistakenly conclude that the buffalo itself is smooth and vague. But when we remember or imagine a temporally distant event, our brains seem to overlook the fact that details vanish with temporal distance, and they conclude instead that the distant events actually are as smooth and vague as we are imagining and remembering them. For example, have you ever wondered why you often make commitments that you deeply regret when the moment to fulfill them arrives? We all do this, of course. We agree to babysit the nephews and nieces next month, and we look forward to that obligation even as we jot it in our diary. Then, when it actually comes time to buy the Happy Meals, set up the Barbie playset, hide the bong, and ignore the fact that the NBA playoffs are on at 1 o'clock, we wonder what we were thinking when we said yes. Well, here's what we were thinking. When we said yes, we were thinking about babysitting in terms of why instead of how, in terms of causes and consequences instead of execution, and we failed to consider the fact that the detail-free babysitting we were imagining would not be the detail-laden babysitting we would ultimately experience. Babysitting next month is an act of love, whereas babysitting right now is an act of lunch, and expressing affection is spiritually rewarding in a way that buying French fries simply isn't. Perhaps it isn't surprising that the gritty details of babysitting that are so salient to us as we execute them were not part of our mental image of babysitting when we imagined it a month earlier, but what is surprising is how surprised we are when those details finally come into view. Distant babysitting has the same illusory smoothness that a distant cornfield does, but while we all know that a cornfield isn't really smooth and that it just looks that way from a far remove, we seem only dimly aware of the same fact when it comes to events that are far away in time. When volunteers are asked to imagine a good day, they imagine a greater variety of events if the good day is tomorrow than if the good day is a year later. Because a good day tomorrow is imagined in considerable detail, it turns out to be a lumpy mixture of mostly good stuff. I'll sleep late, read the paper, go to the movies, and see my best friend, with a few unpleasant chunks, but I guess I'll also have to rake the stupid leaves. On the other hand, a good day next year is imagined as a smooth puree of happy episodes. What's more, when people are asked how realistic they think these mental images of the near and far future are, they claim that the smooth puree of next year is every bit as realistic as the lumpy stew of tomorrow. In some sense, we are like pilots who land our planes and are genuinely shocked to discover that the cornfields that look like smooth, yellow rectangles from the air are actually filled with, of all things, corn. Perception, imagination, and memory are remarkable abilities that have a good deal in common, but in at least one way, perception is the wisest of the triplets. We rarely mistake a distant buffalo for a nearby insect, but when the horizon is temporal rather than spatial, we tend to make the same mistake that pygmies do. The fact that we imagine the near and far futures with such different textures causes us to value them differently as well. Most of us would pay more to see a Broadway show tonight or to eat an apple pie this afternoon than we would if the same ticket and the same pie were to be delivered to us next month. There is nothing irrational about this. Delays are painful, and it makes sense to demand a discount if one must endure them. But studies show that when people imagine the pain of waiting, they imagine that it will be worse if it happens in the near future than in the far future, and this leads to some rather odd behavior. For example, most people would rather receive $20 in a year than $19 in 364 days because a one-day delay that takes place in the far future looks, from here, to be a minor inconvenience. On the other hand, most people would rather receive $19 today than $20 tomorrow because a one-day delay that takes place in the near future looks, from here, to be an unbearable torment. 26 Whatever amount of pain a one-day wait entails, that pain is surely the same whenever it is experienced, and yet, people imagine a near future pain is so severe that they will gladly pay $1 to avoid it, but a far future pain is so mild that they will gladly accept $1 to endure it. Why does this happen? The vivid detail of the near future makes it much more palpable than the far future, thus we feel more anxious and excited when we imagine events that will take place soon than when we imagine events that will take place later. Indeed, studies show that the parts of the brain that are primarily responsible for generating feelings of pleasurable excitement become active when people imagine receiving a reward such as money in the near future but not when they imagine receiving the same reward in the far future. If you've ever bought too many boxes of Thin Mints from the Girl Scout who hawks her wares in front of the local library but too few boxes from the Girl Scout who rings your doorbell and takes your order for future delivery, then you've experienced this anomaly yourself. When we spy the future through our perspectoscopes, the clarity of the next hour and the fuzziness of the next year can lead us to make a variety of mistakes. Onward. Before heading back to Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes couldn't resist polishing his own calabash and giving Inspector Gregory one last poke in the eye. Holmes confided in Watson, "See the value of imagination," said Holmes. "It is the one quality which Gregory lacks. We imagined what might have happened, acted upon the supposition, and find ourselves justified. A very fine poke, but not a very fair one." Inspector Gregory's problem wasn't that he lacked imagination but that he trusted it. Any brain that does the filling in trick is bound to do the leaving out trick as well, and thus the futures we imagine contain some details that our brains invented and lack some details that our brains ignored. The problem isn't that our brains fill in and leave out. God help us if they didn't. No, the problem is that they do this so well that we aren't aware it is happening. As such, we tend to accept the brain's products uncritically and expect the future to unfold with the details, and with only the details, that the brain has imagined. One of imagination's shortcomings, then, is that it takes liberties without telling us it has done so. But if imagination can be too liberal, it can also be too conservative, and that shortcoming has a story of its own.